Well, I follow your work closely, Clive, and I thought it's a really important time to bring you on because here in America, there is a lot of hopium right now that with the new administration come January 2025, a lot of economic woes will disappear. I read with great interest one of your latest pennings where you really do a deep dive on the debt bomb that's ticking here in the United States. Basically, you talk about the debt growing faster than the economy as the interest rate burden will also increase. It's a debt bomb waiting to go pop, you say. Increasing government debt can only continue as long as billionaires, pension funds, and foreign governments continue thinking lending money to the government is a good idea. Clive, my mission for you today is to paint us a picture of the current situation in the United States. Can a magic wand miraculously make this debt go away? What are we looking at? What are we facing?
Well, Daniela, let me start by asking you a question. I'm a very credit-worthy person. Would you lend me a small amount of money?
I trust you, Clive, so yes.
Now, what if I told you that my credit card debt is so large that it exceeds my annual income and the interest payments, because I can't stop spending more and more, are very soon going to exceed my annual salary? Would you then lend me money?
Well, I would still give it to you because I feel bad for you.
That's okay. Well, a lot of people feel that way about the United States, I think,
Right.
But that's the kind of situation we're in. You know, and it's not just. By the way, I'm not picking on the States here. It's a global
Right.
situation. Since the 2008 debt crisis and since COVID, governments have got in the habit of spending a lot more money than they can collect in taxes, and that's called a budget deficit. And when you run a deficit, you have to not only renew your existing debt, but you also have to finance that new debt at today's higher interest rates. They're a lot higher than they were 5 or 10 years ago. Don't forget, 5 or 10 years ago, around the world, we had interest rates effectively at zero. A little bit more than that if you're borrowing for 5 or 10 years. But when governments borrowed money, they were paying much closer to zero than the rates today. So governments are having to refresh their debt. That's the maturing debt, the money they borrowed 5 or 10 years ago, which comes to maturity now. They're having to refresh it at a much higher interest rate. We're talking about 4 point something percent than it was 5 years ago, when it would have been 1%, something like that. So the problem is the interest on a debt burden, which is considerably higher than it was a decade ago, is now rising for two reasons. One, because they're renewing that old debt as it matures at a much higher rate than ever before. And secondly, because they have a budget deficit, which is bigger than it ever has been in history. And they're having to borrow that extra money on top of what they're renewing, also at the higher rates. So the consequence of that is that the interest on the national debt is starting to rise fairly rapidly, and it's going to keep rising. And if we look at the statistics put out by the Congressional Budget Office, their own forecast, this is the government's forecasts, we can see that debt burden rising. And it's going. Currently, we're at the debt is at 100%, and the interest being paid on the debt is about 14%, up from 7% a year or two ago. That interest is going to keep rising, and the level of debt as a percentage of the economy or a percentage of GDP is going to keep rising. So, as the Congressional Budget Office sees it, currently we're at a debt to GDP ratio of 100%. It's more than that if you take into account the Federal Reserve's borrowing and things like that. But if you take the debt owned by the public, we're at around 100%. They see that moving up towards 200% and beyond. And of course, with that, at interest rates, which they're forecasting are well below today's rates, the interest is going to keep spiraling up and up and up. They haven't put their figures out for sufficiently far in the future, but it's quite clear if you follow the trend, the interest is going to exceed the total of the US government's tax take at some point. Certainly, by the time any child who's born today is in his 30s, the real debt will be more than double what it is today, and the interest being paid on that debt is probably going to be 4 or 5 times what it is today. So that interest will be consuming a huge percentage of what the government is taking in taxes. There comes a point where people say, you know what, I'm not so sure that if I lend money to the government, that when they repay me in 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 years' time, that what I will get back will actually buy me the kinds of things I'm going to want to buy in 5, 10, 20 or 30 years' time. Now, I'm not so much talking about the retail or consumer price index, which measures the prices of things which are mass produced. Now, a lot of things which are mass produced are made by robots. So the labor component, which is the variable component which goes in there, and the material costs, they're not that a bigger component. So retail prices won't be rising by as fast as the level of debt rises. But the kinds of things you might want to buy when you retire, which are the luxuries of life, the rarer things, perhaps holidays, perhaps paintings, perhaps you might want to employ people to look after you in your old age. That's a rare commodity, people who look after you. Those things are all going to cost an awful lot more in real terms than they cost today. And that's because the inflation rate of those things will be rising much faster than the retail price index, the consumer price index, for the simple reason that they're in short supply, they're not produced by robots, and the amount of money on the planet and the wealth on the planet have increased a lot. Let me just explain that a lot of people say we only look at the money supply to judge how prices should be rising, but you also have to look at government debt. You see, when the government borrows money, the government gets poorer. It goes deeper and deeper into debt. But the consequence of it going deeper and deeper into debt is that it spends that money on somebody, somewhere. In fact, it spends it on everybody, with social security, benefits, roads, transport, police. Doesn't matter what they spend it on, they're spending it. Obviously, that money then tends to gravitate to the richer part of the community, those people who are mostly those who are in retirement and have accumulated wealth over their lifetime and now need to spend it on care in their old age, on their holidays. Perhaps they want to buy themselves a nicer home. Perhaps they want to have nice paintings on the wall. Those kind of things, the supply of those will not have risen, but the amount of money they hold to buy those things will have risen substantially. And Daniel, I know you're a fan of gold, and gold will be participating in this rise every bit as much as all the other things I mentioned.